The stink attack projectile is actually a very unique particle effect in that it's the first we're going to create that's not going to use an emission rate, but instead use a rate based on distance traveled. This projectile is also going to use a rigid body and a collider so that it can determine when it hits an object and needs to explode. To create this, I'm going to start by creating a new particle system. I'm going to select Create, Particle System. I'm going to change the duration from 5 seconds to 2 seconds, and I'm going to leave looping and play on awake turned on. The lifetimes of these particles are going to be a random between two constants. The values are going to be 0.5 and 1. The start speed of these particles is going to be reduced to 4, and the start size is going to be reduced to 0.75. I'm going to add a start rotation, which is going to be a random between two constants, which is going to range between -45 and 90. I'm going to leave the color the same, however I'm going to change the simulation space to world and the scaling mode to shape. I'm going to jump ahead and hop down to the renderer, where I'm going to change the material from the default particle material to shaded smoke. Next, I'm going to open up the emission module and change the rate from time to distance with a value of 5. We can see now that we no longer see any emission. However, if I move the game object, I get smoke. Since this makes it a little bit harder to see the effect as we're building it, for now, I'm actually going to change the rate back to time. All we'll need to do when we're ready is just flip that back over to distance. In the shape module, I'm going to change it from a cone to a sphere. I want my sphere to have a radius that is 0.01. Then I'm going to add a limit velocity over lifetime module. I'm going to leave the values of the limit velocity over lifetime module the way they are by default. Another module I'm going to add is a color over lifetime module. For the color over lifetime module, I'm actually going to choose the preset that we created for our other stink particle systems. However, I'm going to bring this third key on top inward towards the middle, and I'm going to reduce its opacity. Next, I'm going to add a size over lifetime module. I'm going to make the size over lifetime a random between two curves. The values of these curves are going to be between 0 and 2. Our top curve is going to start at 2 and end at 0. But for now, I'm going to leave it above there so we're able to grab this second keyframe. Our second curve is going to start at 1 and end at about 0.5. Now I can bring that last keyframe all the way down. I'm going to modify this so it's not actually 0.5, but maybe a little bit smaller, just like that. Now the particle system on our parent stink projectile is done. I'm going to go back up to this emission and change it to distance. We can see that when we click and drag, we have particles emitted. The last thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to rename this particle system to be stink projectile. The stink projectile requires a second particle system which is going to have very similar values. So I'm going to right click on the stink projectile and select duplicate. I'm then going to nest this new game object underneath the original stink projectile. And for clarity, I'm going to rename this gas projectile _ dust bits. Now I'm going to go ahead and walk through this particle effect window and change the things that need to be changed. I'm going to leave the duration, however I'm going to change the start lifetime to be of values between 1.5 and 1. I'm going to leave the start speed the way it is, and I'm going to reduce the size even further down to 0.25. I'm going to leave the rest of the values in this module alone. Under emission, I'm going to set it back to time so we can see it while we're working on it. For shape, we're going to leave this as a sphere with a radius of 0.01. We're also going to leave the limit velocity over lifetime module alone. For the color over lifetime, we're going to modify this gradient. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this pink color all the way to the left. I'm also going to modify the second alpha key to be only half opacity. I'm then going to modify the third alpha key to be 0 opacity. This way, these dust bits are very subtle. I'm going to leave the size over lifetime alone. However, in the renderer, I'm going to make some changes. First, I'm going to click the circle selector next to this shaded smoke, and I'm actually going to choose the default particle. Then, I'm going to change it from being a billboard to being a stretched billboard. The length scale of this is going to be negative 0.97. The effect that's going to have is going to cause them to be slightly elliptical, or like an oval. I also want these to appear on top of the other particles, so I'm going to give this a sorting fudge. I'm going to go something like a negative 0.9. Now that these are done, I'm going to go ahead back up to the emission tab and change it back to distance. Now to see the whole particle effect, I'm going to click on the Stink Projectile game object in the hierarchy and click and drag, and we'll see the projectile with the little bits of dust in there. Finally, we need to do some additional work on our Stink Projectile. You'll recall that this is going to be affected by physics. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new component. I'm going to click Add Component, Physics, Rigid Body. Now, I don't really want this rigid body to affect the motion of this object. It's going to be controlled through script. So I'm going to uncheck Use Gravity and check Is Kinematic. I really only need this rigid body so that I can get collisions. I don't really need forces for anything. Next, I'm going to click Add Component, Physics, Sphere Collider. Now I don't want this projectile to actually collide with and move other objects, so I'm going to check Is Trigger. I also want to significantly reduce its radius, so I'm going to drop it down to 0.1. Finally, to add the functionality, I'm going to add another component. I'm going to click Add Component, Scripts, and I'm going to find the Stink Projectile script. This script is going to control the speed of the projectile, the arc of the lob of the projectile, or how it's going to fly through the air. It's also going to enable a stink hit game object when it collides with something. I'm going to reduce the speed down from 20 to 10. Then I'm going to click on this arc property, which is an animation curve. And what we're effectively going to do is we're going to try to draw what we want the arc of this projectile to look like from the side. So I'm going to start by just creating a line by clicking on the line preset. Then I want the first keyframe to go all the way down to the value of 0. Getting an exact value is not really all that important for now. We're mostly just prototyping. I'm going to do the same for the end keyframe. If we wanted to be specific about our values, we could always right-click on the keyframe and say Edit Key, and then I could just type in a value of 0 and 0. I'll do the same for the last key, typing in a value of 1 for time and a value of 0. Now about the 80% mark, we want our projectile to cap out about 1 unit higher than when it started. So I'm going to double click to create a keyframe, and I'm going to click and drag this all the way up to the value of 1. Then I don't really want this to be quite as steep, so I'm going to add one more keyframe and bring it out a bit. And then I'm going to click on the last keyframe and just angle it upwards. So while this isn't really a realistic representation of something being thrown, it still is going to give us the visual effect that we want. I'm going to make one more tweak to our first keyframe. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. The last thing this stink projectile needs is it needs to know where it can find a stink hit game object. I have a stink hit game object in the scene from one of our earlier sections, so I'm going to click and drag that over to the stink hit property on the stink projectile script. Finally, I'm going to open up the VFX subfolder of the prefabs folder, click and drag the stink projectile game object into the project window. I'm then going to go to the stink attack game object underneath the player's antenna game object, and where it has the property for stink projectile underneath weapon references, I'm just going to click and drag the stink projectile we just created. Since we don't want this stink projectile to start being turned on, I'm going to go ahead and disable it. Now, I'm going to press play and we can test it out. I'm going to tab over to our stink attack. And then I will aim and fire. And we'll see the enemy run away. Again, I'll fire, and I'll notice that while the weapon is on cooldown, my reticule turns yellow. In the next section, we're going to go ahead and take this attack and integrate it into our main scene.